Welcome to Chinese Food and Ashkenazi Jews, a love affair. I am Michelle Landau, President of Women's Philanthropy and a legacy donor. On behalf of our community and everyone that has benefited from your generosity, thank you. Your unwavering support of the UJA annual campaign for 25 years or more is remarkable. I look forward to the day when I can join you in this meaningful Ner Tamid society. It was March 13th, almost a year to the day, when the reality of the COVID-19 crisis hit us. What we hoped would be a passing experience turned into a worldwide pandemic. While Federation initially closed its physical doors, it never ceased to continue to provide emotional, physical, financial, and spiritual support here at home, in Israel, and around the globe to the Jewish community and beyond. Why have you been giving to Federation all of these years? Is it because you know that for Federation to be here in times of crisis, Federation must be here during the calm? The response systems had to be in place for Federation to distribute an additional $1 million inside the first week of the pandemic. Since then, the Jewish Federation and Jewish Community Foundation have distributed a collective $8.4 million in COVID relief. Because of the support you give to Federation, Federation can and has helped the most vulnerable in our community. We could not have done this without your support. Passover is just 9 days away. And like last year, and much to our dismay, most of us will be experiencing small Passover Seders again. Some among us, and many more, will be recipients of the Passover food boxes that are being prepared by Federation volunteers and delivered to partner agencies for distribution as we speak. I am pleased to share that through April 30th, we have a one-to-one UJA match on any new or increased gift that will go directly back to the local community. In fact, today only, through midnight tonight, your gift can have triple the impact with a 2-to-1 match on any new and increased gifts to the annual campaign. That means that $100 becomes $300. All you need to do is go to jfedgmw.org, unlock the good to make your donation. Our Federation will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2023. To acknowledge this milestone, we are undertaking our largest campaign ever to ensure the viability and strength of the Jewish Federation into the next 100 years. You can join this campaign by establishing your own Jewish legacy. Personally, endowing my lion gift was one of the most meaningful moments of this past year for me. As I reflected on how our Federation community was responding to the COVID crisis today, I knew I was ensuring that my gift could also help in the future. Thank you for your support and thank you for joining us today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Renee Golish.
Good afternoon and welcome to our Ner Tamid Thank You program, Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese Food, a love affair. I'm Renee Golish, and together with Susan Weinstock and Rebecca Gold, we're delighted to present this informative and entertaining program. Our speaker, Andrew Ko, is a food critic, culinary historian, and author. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Gastronomica, and the Atlantic. In addition, Andrew has authored several books, most notably Chop Suey, A Cultural History of Chinese Food in the United States. A fun fact, chop suey was once the most famous Chinese dish in America. For many Ashkenazi Jews in the United States, thoughts of egg roll and General Chow's chicken bring back happy memories. Why do Jews have an affinity for Chinese food? Andrew will take us back to the turn of the century Lower East Side to explore this phenomenon and might even provide some inspiration for tonight's dinner. We will be answering questions at the end of the session. Please add your questions into the chat anytime during the program. And now our speaker, Andrew Ko.
Thank you very much. Inspiration for dinner is always what I'm looking for. So without further ado, why don't we get going? Jews and Chinese food, a love affair. Two men, one Jewish, the other Chinese, are seated next to each other on a plane. They start comparing their respective cultures. Says the Chinese man, "We're an old civilization. This is the year 4718 in the Chinese calendar." "Well, we're older. This is 5781 in the Jewish calendar," replies his seatmate. The Chinese man makes a quick calculation. "So, for 1,000 years, what did you eat?" According to my research, that is the oldest Jewish-Chinese food joke. Actually, Jews have only been eating Chinese food for about 120 years. Beginning around 1880, hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe arrived in New York City. This is a map of the Lower East Side, of the Lower Manhattan, and here's where they settled, the circled area on the right, the Lower East Side, east of the Bowery, south of Rivington Street, at the time the most densely populated area on Earth. Most of them were shtetl born. They were used to a diet of bread and potatoes, herring, milk, and cheese. Meat was a luxury, only consumed on Shabbat and holidays. Many of them had never patronized a restaurant. This is Hester Street around 1900. Housewives with baskets are clustered around the fishmonger. They're buying carp to turn into gefilte fish for their Friday evening dinner. But not all the immigrants were from the shtetls. Some came from big cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna. And not everyone from the shtetl was a greenhorn who behaved like Tevye the milkman. The Lower East Side was dotted with restaurants and coffee shops catering to the small clans of Yiddish-speaking sophisticates, the theater crowd, poets and writers, and assorted socialists, communists, anarchists, and so on. This is this scene inside a socialist cafe on the Lower East Side. At the same time that Eastern European Jews were settling on the Lower East Side, a few blocks away on Mott and Pell Street, a small group of Chinese immigrants were building the New York's first Chinatown. They opened businesses catering to their community, including Chinese restaurants. Around 1885, Chinatown was discovered by the bohemian crowd, uptown artistic rebels who liked to sample the exotic flavors of the new immigrant restaurants. On Mott Street, they tried something called chow chop suey, a toothsome stew made of bean sprouts, chicken parts, and other unidentified ingredients. Chinese chefs toned down the dish and came up with what we know today as chop suey. Here's a modern iteration: celery, onions, and bean sprouts, chicken, shrimp, and roast pork, everything contained in a gloppy sauce. This is the dish that launched the fad for Chinese food in the United States. So in these early years, did Jewish bohemians follow the crowds down to Chinatown to eat chop suey? My guess is probably not. But after 1900, Chinese restaurants began to open outside of Chinatown, including along the Jewish East Side. Here's a menu from a restaurant on 3rd Avenue between 14th and 15th Street. You already see Chinese American favorites like, here you see chop suey, down here chow mein, and at the bottom fo young dan, which is obviously egg foo young. This was Chinese food made safe and palatable for Western tastes. Jewish New Yorkers avidly gobbled it down. How do we know? Here's a 1914 description of the kind of customer you'd find in a Chinese restaurant. It's the proletariat that's chiefly given to hungering for Chinese fare. Its crowds are composed of commoners, clerks and shop girls, minds on rare outings and gaudy, tasteless finery. Sprinklings of many nationalities glean from the motley East Side. Your hearing doesn't have to be particularly acute to hear those dog whistles. At the same time, Chinese restaurants started advertising in publications aimed at a Jewish audience. This 1914 ad ran in the program for a Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue. Brooklyn's Tangerine Gardens advertised in the foreword. Its chef supposedly prepared his chicken chow mein following the same recipe used by the Chinese emperor's kitchens. You could get it for just 75 cents. And you see the 2 fingers pointed inward. That's the ad for the 75-cent chicken chow mein. Jade Mountain was a favorite of the left-wing crowd. Its ads in the Daily Worker boasted of proletarian prices and exhorted, comrades, try real Chinese food. What was the attraction? In the food world of the early 20th century, there was nothing more exotic than a Chinese restaurant. The weird imported furniture, colorful paper lanterns, supposedly inscrutable waiters, and menus filled with mysterious dishes. This was when newspapers were filled with stories about Chinatown tong wars and opium dens. Rumors said that most chop suey joints were fronts for the white slave trade. A young woman visited a Chinese restaurant alone at her peril. Jewish diners discovered an extra thrill in eating Chinese food because many of the dishes included shrimp, lobster, and pork. Their immigrant parents faithfully followed the laws of kashrut, which they saw as a central tenet of their faith. But the younger generation was eager to enjoy the fruits of American life. They attended public school, got jobs, and went out for lunch with co-workers. When they saw a ham sandwich on the menu, they ordered it and with a little thrill, gobbled down the forbidden food. However, eating a ham on rye with a little mustard couldn't compare to one's first visit to a Chinese restaurant. In Jewish fiction of the era, a woman's initiation to Chinese food was often associated with sex. The first taste of shrimp, rubbery and slimy. The first bite of pink and glistening slabs of roast pork. In Herman Wouk's novel Marjorie Morningstar, the title character is a virgin until the evening her boyfriend offers her a plate of char siu or roast pork. Here's the initial thrill and then the letdown. Eating pork gave her an odd sense of freedom, and at the same time, though she suppressed it, a twinge of disgust. Others navigated between tradition and modernity with far less anxiety. Molly Picon was the queen of Yiddish stage and screen. A newspaper profile revealed that at home she kept kosher, but outside she loves to go to a Chinese restaurant and eat roast pork. That's her favorite. Keeping kosher at home, or at least on holidays, but enjoying treif in the outside world was a common practice. And it seemed particularly easy to enjoy treif foods at a Chinese restaurant. The rationalizations came on many levels. In Eastern Europe, kosher law had been a way for Jews to define themselves against the larger Christian society. But what religion were the Chinese? And Chinese food seemed almost Jewish. They used a lot of onions. There was no dairy on their menus. Wontons looked like kreplach. And then there were the ways the pork was served: shredded in egg rolls, cubed in chop suey and fried rice, scenting the stock of wonton soup. If you couldn't see it, it didn't count. They coined a term for it: safe trafe. Still, there was often a certain amount of guilt involved. There was the rabbi who liked to sneak down to Chinatown to eat a certain dish. And wouldn't you know it, one day a member of his congregation wanders into the restaurant. "Rabbi, how are you? What are you doing here?" Just then, the waiter sets down in front of the rabbi a platter containing a whole roast suckling pig with an apple in its mouth. "Can you believe the production they make in this place?" exclaims the rabbi. "You order an apple and they bring you this." As the 20th century progressed, Chinese restaurants were transformed from exotic eating places to neighborhood favorites, where the patrons knew the names of all the waiters. By the 1930s, Brownsville, Brooklyn had become the city's largest Jewish neighborhood, eclipsing the Lower East Side. On Pitkin Avenue, the Wuhan Tea Garden, which you see here, was a favorite setting for family dinners, mahjong parties, and bar mitzvahs. Here's part of the menu. The specialties are on the left, and the ever popular family dinners on the right. And if you look on the left, you see fresh roast pork large portion, pork hens, and then lobster down below. And over here on the family dinners, it's more pork and shrimp and dishes like that. Chinese food also wasn't just for restaurants. Jews also began to prepare it at home. The most popular dish was probably chicken chow mein. The easiest way to prepare it was through the magic of canned foods manufactured by La Choy or Chun King. The meals were sold in 2 canned packs, with a chicken stew on top and crispy noodles on the bottom. If you wanted to make it at home, you could use the recipes printed in the foreword in other Jewish newspapers, or in the cookbooks by trusted experts like Jenny Grossinger of the Grossinger's Resort family. This is her famous chicken chow mein recipe. It was a dish that they served on El Al on the flights to Israel. And here she is with Danny Kaye, who deserves his own sidebar. Brooklyn-born Daniel Kaminsky discovered the delights of real Chinese food on a vaudeville tour of Asia during the 1930s. He was determined to learn how to cook that food himself, befriending famous Chinese chefs in order to learn their kitchen secrets. After he became Danny Kaye movie star, he bought a house in Beverly Hills to which he added a complete Chinese restaurant kitchen, including a Peking duck oven. This is a scene inside his Chinese kitchen. Some people install insanely elaborate train sets in their basements. Danny Kaye's obsession was preparing real Chinese food, from family dinners to complete banquets. His guests ranged from Hollywood royalty to the tellers down at his bank. Considering the tastes of most movie stars, I'm not sure how many actually enjoyed it. After World War II, the Jewish exodus extended to the suburbs, where they moved into neat tract houses unspoiled by urban grit and crowds. Their religious, cultural, and culinary needs were met by synagogues, community centers, and Chinese restaurants. Eating Chinese was no longer the edgy urban experience of half a century earlier. For families, it became a weekly ritual. Sunday night chow mein, always sitting in the same booth, having the same arguments, and ordering the same dishes. Will Elder illustrated the perils of these meals in his Mad Magazine feature, Restaurants. Here, the Sturdley family, we see them over here in the middle left, waits patiently for a booth amid the chaos of a Chinese restaurant on a Sunday afternoon. Now, after many trials and tribulations, Pa Sturdley is about to take his first bite of chicken chow mein. Whoops, baby has to leave the room. And notice this bit of chicken fat, which was the technical term for Will Elder's background gags. Today's special, egg foo young with gefilte fish. During this era, Jews found another role for Chinese restaurants. Ever since their immigrant grandparents first set foot in America, they had faced the challenge of Christmas. Those who chanced to arrive at Ellis Island around the end of December were bewildered by the halls decorated with Christmas trees. Toys and cookies were pushed into their children's hands. Eager to Americanize and Christianize Eastern European Jews, public schools featured big Christmas celebrations during which all students had to sing Christmas carols. Jewish community leaders forced the Board of Education to halt those festivities. Weaning East Siders from such habits as exchanging presents on December 25th proved a harder task. Their solution, of course, was to elevate Hanukkah from a relatively minor Jewish holiday into big league status. That meant Hanukkah rituals, foods, decorations, games, presents, all the things that could compete with the Christmas industrial complex. However, Jews still faced the question of what to do on Christmas Day when everything was shut down. They could stay home and play games. They could go to a movie theater or to the Catskills or a Miami Beach hotel, or they could eat Chinese for Christmas. What better idea than to go down to Chinatown and stand in line outside of Wo Hop for an hour or so? It might be freezing cold, but they knew that steaming bowls of egg drop soup and chicken chop suey over rice waited for them inside. During the 1960s and 70s, American Jews' relationship to Chinese food changed as they themselves changed. The first innovation was the appearance of the kosher Chinese restaurant Bernstein on Essex, aka Schmulke Bernstein's of blessed memory, where West meets East for a Chinese feast and kashrut is guaranteed. It was actually a Jewish deli that started serving rabbinically approved Chinese food 2 nights a week. The menu included chow mein Bernstein made with chicken livers, and I think the guy on the right looks like he could be having it. And like at Ratner's, many of the waiters were Chinese, adept at mimicking the mannerisms of dour Jewish waiters. Kosher Chinese food was originally mostly a novelty act. Those in the know went to Bernstein's for the spicy pastrami, not the chow mein. Then in 1963, Ruth and Bob Grossman published their Chinese Kosher Cookbook. The recipes are written with a heavy dose of Borscht Belt shtick. The dishes have names like string beans tsuris, haddock yenta, and sweet and pungent beef chunks oi gewalt. But still, the recipes actually work. Gradually, more full-service kosher Chinese restaurants started opening, such as Moishe Peking in Midtown and Shang Chai and Yun Ki in Brooklyn. In New Jersey, the Yang family bought the Sabra Kosher restaurant and added rabbinically approved Chinese dishes to the menu. That meant the Eastern European version of Chinese food, heavy, vegetables a bit overcooked, with veal taking the place of pork and flounder replacing shrimp. Still, for the increasing numbers of Jews who kept kosher, liked to eat out, and wanted Asian flavors, kosher Chinese was the only game in town. During the same era, the 60s and 70s, not so observant Jews were growing bored with the weekly visits to Lee's for chow mein and egg rolls. Thanks to changes in immigration laws, waves of Chinese immigrants were arriving from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. They brought with them food traditions from other parts of China, particularly Sichuan and Hunan, and began to open restaurants. The food was challenging, featuring new ways of eating, like hot pot, which became a favorite of culinary sophisticates. And new flavors, particularly chili peppers, the hotter the better. Milton Glaser and Jerome Snyder's Underground Gourmet column in New York Magazine was the most popular guide to these cuisines. It extolled the delights of dishes like minced pork with bean cake, which we now know as mapo tofu. It became a sign of your culinary hipness if you could enjoy it cooked Sichuan spicy. By the 1980s, Chinese food had become American Jews' favorite foreign cuisine. But this primacy was challenged not by one cuisine, but one dish from another Asian culture: sushi. A slice of fish on top of a finger of vinegar-filled flavored rice. Sushi was the decade's trendiest food. For Jews, it had a particular attraction. Everyone was on a diet. Sushi seemed a lot healthier than greasy and heavy Chinese food. For the observant, the dish was particularly useful because it was parve, so it could be served with fewer kosher restrictions. Chicken chow mein disappeared from buffets at bar mitzvahs and weddings, replaced by big trays of sushi rolls. Chinese restaurants fought back by hiring their own Chinese sushi chefs under the correct assumption that their customers couldn't tell one Asian from another. This is the sushi menu of Cho Sen Garden, a kosher Chinese restaurant in Queens, which is still open, by the way. So here we are in 2021. When we emerge from quarantine, we'll find that a lot has changed in the world of food. However, I think Jews will still be a people that likes to eat chicken chow mein, kung pao shrimp, and mushu pork. Christmas Day will still mean a visit to a Chinese restaurant and a movie. How do I know? Because there's a restaurant called Genghis Cohen in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles that serves crispy Canton knishes and shalom pork. Because for Christmas Day in 2020, the Mile End Deli in Brooklyn offered a special menu that included whitefish rangoon and chopped chicken liver wonton soup. And because there are still people out there like these guys, who for the past decades have been scouring New York City and its surroundings for the best Chinese food. In 2021, they promise they will be back. Better, stronger, cast iron bellies, ready to try everything, seconds of everything, bring them on. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. This was really a treat. I'm very, very, very hungry right now. Fun fact, my first date was to Beatlemania and lunch at Shmoka Bernstein's with the grandson, Gary Bernstein. If anyone knows him, let me know where he is. So that was exciting to hear about that. I was really excited. Thank you for this fascinating history.
Did you have Chinese food or the pastrami?
No, I had Chinese food.
Good for you.
I'm Rebecca Gold, an aspiring Ner Tamid Society member. I think I have 4 years to go, and a very, very proud Lion of Judah legacy donor. We have some questions from our viewers. Andrew, you ready?
I certainly am.
Where did you get the idea that this was something to explore and research?
Well, I'm a historian, and I was looking through photo archives in the New York Public Library, and I saw I'd seen pictures of Chinatown in New York in the 40s, and there were big signs on top of every restaurant saying "chop suey." And I was down there, a few days later, which I go to, I've been going to Chinatown for many, many years. And I just noticed that all those chop suey signs had disappeared. And I'd never really eaten much chop suey, but I just started asking myself, like, what was chop suey? And, why was it so popular and where did it go? What happened? And it just, from there, it snowballed. And I started doing historical research, and that turned into an article which was published in American Heritage. And I turned that into a book called Chop Suey, A Cultural History of Chinese Food in the United States. And here we are today.
Thank
and
you.
I still eat Chinese food.
As many of us do. Can you recommend a modern kosher Chinese cookbook?
That's a good question. There's actually one on my shelf back here, which It's a used. I picked up the used book. I don't know if you can if it's backwards or not, but it's Chinese Kosher Cooking by Betty Goldberg.
Okay.
And this is it's a serious Chinese cookbook. Adapted for kosher cooks. But I think this is the best one which I've seen, which it hasn't been sort of dumbed down to American tastes. But this was published back in the 1980s. None of the books that I've seen published more recently. I'm into real Chinese food, not Chinese American food. So, and most of the Chinese kosher cookbooks these days are something, more like things you would see in a Chinese American restaurant.
Another question is, what's the best Chinese restaurant in the New York area? Everybody wants to know.
Well, it depends on what kind of food you like. I mean, first of all, we don't know once we emerge from the pandemic what restaurants will open up and which will not. And one of the many bad effects of the pandemic is that most of the dim sum restaurants have closed down, because this is a big communal eating experience, and it's certainly not healthy.
Sure.
During these times. So we don't know how many dim sum restaurants will open up. But currently my favorite food is Sichuan food. And there's very good Sichuan restaurants open here in Sunset Park, near me in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, including one called Chuan Yu, that's CHUAN, and new word YUE. That one I can recommend.
Thank you very much. There's a great question from Ava Reinfeld. Are you familiar with Edward Schoenfeld, who became the white face for some Chinese restaurants?
Ed Schoenfeld, yes, I know Ed Schoenfeld, and he's an important person, very important VIP of the Chinese food world in New York City, and tremendously influential in this world. He started out actually as somebody who really loved Chinese food and started sort of putting on special Chinese dinners. He began working with some of the first Sichuan chefs in New York City, and was an important part of running some of the most important Sichuan restaurants in the 70s and 80s. And really helped bring Sichuan food to the United States. And then there was a bit of a hiatus, and then during the last 10 years, he sort of like reemerged to open the Red Farm restaurants, and also the Peking Duck restaurant Decoy, and it's tremendously high quality food. He's a real force of nature in the Chinese food world, and we all owe him a debt of gratitude.
Except for the ducks.
Yes, except for the ducks.
So this is very prescient for what we're going to speak about at the end of the program. I understand you also co-authored the book A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, that deals with the scarcity of food during the Depression. Thank you.
This book, yes.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that book and what you learned and how it might relate to today's rising food insecurity?
Well, I wrote the book with my wife, Jane Siegelman, and it's a book about, most of the books and articles I've written about food history are about having food, but that book was a book about people not having food. And it was a very hard book to write because there was a lot of, it's a very depressing subject. But it really shows, I think one of the things that we learned is that you cannot ignore hungry people. And it's not just for, to feed them and so that they have full bellies, but for the good of the entire, community and for the good of the entire nation. We need like a healthy populace. And one of the best and most inexpensive ways that you can do that is to feed people. And more importantly, not just feed people, not just give people like potatoes and rice, but let people feed themselves. So give them the wherewithal But I mean, currently now, that would be something like, SNAP benefits to feed themselves.
Right,
And
right.
that really
So
makes
important.
a huge difference.
Absolutely. So important. Thank you. So this is a more difficult question even than that, is in light of the horrific events of today, as Asian Americans are under attack, please give us some historical context and your perspective on this.
Well, unfortunately, attacks on Asian Americans are not new. And just from my own research in Chinese American history, during the 19th century, lots of Chinese came to the United States to work in, particularly California, to work in the gold fields during the California Gold Rush. And there arose a big kind of nativist movement, which was it was called "The Chinese Must Go." And they didn't want to just throw the Chinese out of this country. They also burned Chinatowns. They massacred groups of Chinese workers who were, very hardworking and productive people who were, doing things like growing vegetables so that people could eat. And one of the reasons that we have Chinatowns on the East Coast in New York and Boston and Washington and places like that is because these were built by refugees from the West.
Right.
So it's nothing new, and unfortunately, and there are two. In historically, there are two reasons why I think these things happen. One is simply fear of the other, that these people are aliens, will bring foreign contagions of, cultural contagions or medical contagions, and also fear of economic competition. And when these fears arise, if people who are in the government don't take action to stop them and to support the Asian American community, things can get out of control, and that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, today.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for individuals to take a personal position if they see an injustice, to speak up and not just let somebody else deal with it. I think we all know about scapegoating, and it's no small thing to stick up for somebody if you hear something. So the personal responsibility and accountability is so important as well. So
Absolutely.
thank you for that. So going back to some lighter questions, we have a few in here. Was Chinese food, the popularity of Chinese food, sort of an opening and trailblazer for the popularity of Thai food and Korean food? And have they eclipsed Chinese food in popularity, or is Chinese food still at the top of the game?
Well, Chinese, let's say, well, that's a complicated question. Okay, first of all, Chinese food is still number one. I believe there's still more Chinese restaurants than there are maybe McDonald's and Burger Kings combined. Chinese restaurants are in just about every community of any size in the United States. But it's certainly the interest in Chinese food certainly paved the way for Thai food and Japanese food, and all other kinds of Asian food in the United States. This was the first, we discovered Chinese food in the 1880s, and this was the first Asian cuisine that we ever really fell in love with. And, American tastes, people were very, very parochial before that. And essentially, it was a sort of version of English food that we preferred, with a little bit of French food added onto that for the upper classes. But we didn't eat Italian food during the 1880s, so this was like the first really alien cuisine that we ever really fell in love with, and its introduction really changed American food culture completely.
So we had an interesting communication with one of our Tamid donors, Dick Stewart, whose father had an interest, invested in, I forget the name. Lum Fang. And you had an interesting comment about Lum Fang and how important he was to American cultural Chinese food. Tell
Well,
everybody what
Lam
that is.
Fong, which was on Canal Street in New York's Chinatown, is important because Lam Fong invented the egg roll. And like many Chinese American dishes, the egg roll does not, as such, does not exist in China. The Chinese eat spring rolls, which are smaller, crispier, not so much filling. They're just like a little crispy bite, like an appetizer. But you've had an egg roll. An egg roll is something which is like half a meal right there. It's this big, heavily wrapped, meat and vegetables and greasy, lovely greasy dish. And he invented the egg roll, and it just became it's a staple of the Chinese American kitchen.
Yeah.
And you see it every supermarket has frozen egg rolls in the freezer case. I mean,
That's right. That's right. Well, that's very interesting, and that leads me to maybe one of our last questions. There was actually a comment from Albert Silberman early on that he'd had chow mein at a school cafeteria, mediocre, and then a local Chinese restaurant, also mediocre, but then was in the military in Taiwan and in Japan and found the food absolutely delicious. And he was curious that whether or not other military folks have had that experience. But my question is, how how does the American version or even the Americanized version of real Chinese food differ from authentic Chinese food? Is there one or two real differences that we don't get here?
well, if you to sum up Chinese American food in one phrase, it's overcooked. It's
Very Jewish.
So the vegetables are Chinese like their vegetables like sort of light and fresh and crispy. They're not wild about like heavy gloppy sauces like you find on chop suey and chow mein. And and they don't and they also are not so meat centric as Americans are. Um, and so their chow mein is an authentic Chinese food with tons of variations all over China. But I mean, the classic one is Hong Kong style chow mein, which is noodles which are like fried. You fry the noodles in the pan, so they're crispy on the bottom and soft on the top. And then you put on a mix of vegetables and chicken or seafood on top of that, and it's all in a sort of very light, fresh sauce. So it gives you an array of flavors and textures.
Wonderful.
But Chinese American food is so cooked down that it's one flavor and one texture, which is kind of soft.
Right.
And because we don't appreciate textures, but texture is incredibly important for Chinese food.
Right. So my last question is, where do you think Chinese food in America is headed now? Is there a trend towards more authenticity, towards variations, fusion, which I know has been partly evolving?
Well, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen, as we come out of the pandemic. So that's a big question mark. And the other question is what kind of Chinese food that we eat in the United States really depends on immigration. And it depends on how many, how many Chinese immigrants are allowed in and where they're from, because they bring in the foods of, whatever region, whatever province they come from. So we were originally, Chinese American food is all from southeastern China, but then we started getting immigrants from Sichuan and Hunan and northern China, and so we have a lot more variety in food.
Sure.
So the question is, who will be coming in and what kind of restaurants will be opening up? And right now, the sort of new things, the sort of innovations that are being brought into Chinese food in the United States are being brought in to feed and also by the Chinese student population, which has been coming over, increasing numbers in the last 10 years. And the real question is if they're going to come, if they're going to continue to come. And that is really going to make a lot of difference with Chinese food. I mean, just to, a thought, the great variety and sort of splendors of the foods that we are able to eat in the United States all depends on immigration. It's the waves and waves of immigrants who have really influenced and made American food what it is today.
Right.
And just from my own personal, taste, I want to see the immigrants continue to come because I
Absolutely.
love the variety and the excitement of, being able to try their food.
Absolutely. That's such a positive way to think about new people coming to a community who maybe you're a little nervous about, or you just feel unsettled because things are changing, and we have to stay open to new ideas, new flavors, and that's a great way, a great spin on this, and I really appreciate it. So, Andrew, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Most of us on this call may be excited about going back to our favorite Chinese restaurant. I know I am, though for many community members, they're just wondering from where their next meal will come from. As we talked about food insecurity, it's a serious, serious problem right now. Thanks to you, our loyal donors, Federation is actively engaged in addressing food insecurity through food distributions and funding support of our partner agencies, Jewish Family Service of Central New Jersey and Metro West. After the program, we will randomly choose 3 names from all the participants, and the 3 lucky winners will receive a signed copy of Andrew's book, Chop Suey, which will be mailed to you in the coming week. We hope you enjoyed the program today. You all inspire me tremendously by your unwavering dedication and generosity to the Federation, to helping the Jewish community through our Jewish Federation. We look forward to seeing you at our next Ner Tamid Society Thank You event on June 16th at 7 o'clock in the evening, featuring the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. As soon as you log off Zoom, you will receive a survey from this Zoom. Please take a moment to respond. Have a good evening, and thank you again.